Hi, and welcome everybody. Today we're going to be doing our webinar, our Knowledge is Power series for how to lower your property taxes, and thank you for joining us today. Today's guest is going to be Rich O'Donnell. Rich is a property tax consultant with the firm of O'Donnell and Cullen, and he is a retired tax assessor with over 28 years of local government service in Westchester and a former two-term president of the Westchester County chapter of the New York State Assessors Association. He has assisted thousands of property owners in seeking the maximum tax reduction possible. So we're very fortunate and lucky to have him on our program today. And Rich, I want to thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'm happy to be here.
Great. So why don't we just get into it? You know, one of the things that we do, you know, when we're about to work with a homeowner and make sure that, you know, that we can market their property at a high level is that we take a look at what their taxes are in relation to the value of the property. And what we find more often than not is that the value of the property or the taxes being charged on that property are considerably higher than what they should be paying for the current value of their house. So for example, a house where the town is saying, you know, it's worth $1.3 million, in actuality, the house may be worth $900,000. And these folks have been paying these inflated taxes for many years. And that high tax amount actually can have a negative impact on their home sale, because someone that's searching for a $900,000 home is going to look at the taxes and say to themselves, wait a minute, I'm not going to pay taxes that are, you know, 20 or 30% higher than other $900,000 homes that I'm looking at. And that can be a real turnoff to a buyer on a property. And I'm sure you've seen a ton of that, correct?
Yes, a lot of our business these days, Mark, is in representing sellers looking to be proactive in this regard, because obviously, and as you know, the taxes are a big issue. Two things, how much per month in taxes, how much per month in mortgage, and obviously if the tax can be reduced, there's more money available for the mortgage bucket.
Right. And so just to give people kind of a sense of you know, what you do in the marketplace as far as tax grievance goes, because, you know, I meet with people and they have no idea, you know, that this is even an option, how to go about it, who to call, you know, what is a grievance? You know, I say that word and they kind of look at me a little funny. So what does a property tax consultant like yourself actually do?
Well, it's funny you asked the question in that way, Mark, because in our business model, we simply answer questions 7 days a week for anybody who has any interest. Whether they have a case or not, we're happy to educate them, go over their assessment, and let them know whether we believe or whether our third-party appraisers believe that they're a candidate for reduction. So it started out where people would pick my brain when they realized I retired from the government side. Didn't know I was going to make any money doing that, but now we figured out that's the sauce. So anytime anybody has any questions whatsoever, they should call or email us, and we do our very best to get back to them with the same day. In the same day, whether they have a potential case or not. And that is how we work. Obviously, we do get a lot of phone calls. We do have a lot of inquiries, but we do believe that educating people on all the tricky nuances of this business is a good business model.
Right. Now, the reason that we're kind of doing this call today is that there's certain times of the year that you can go to your town tax assessor and, you know, put in a grievance, put in to get your taxes reevaluated. So can you explain kind of what the assessment calendar is? Sure.
In all Westchester towns and cities, with the exception of Yonkers and White Plains, they all have a June 1st tentative assessment roll. And then the grievance deadline is the third Tuesday of June. So between June 1st and the third Tuesday is when you file your application with the Board of Assessment Review. The board will deliberate and issue their decision in mid to late September. And then if you're unhappy with that decision, which is not unusual, the boards are overloaded and have very little time for each case. If you're disappointed in that decision, there's a second option known as small claims assessment review. That is a court proceeding that's going to add perhaps 3 or 4 months, depending upon the court's calendar or the municipality's volume of cases. But the outcome generally will result in savings starting in April of the following year. There are a few exceptions to that rule, but as I said, all Westchester towns and cities, with the exception of Yonkers and White Plains, has a June 1st to the third Tuesday of June grievance window.
Okay, great. Now, obviously, we're in this new reality with the virus, and municipal offices are working on a staggered basis or remotely. How has that impacted this whole process?
Another great question. We're getting a lot of calls with people making the assumption that this virus, this horrible situation, is driving values down, and therefore now would be a great time to challenge. But what they don't realize that most municipalities have a valuation date, July 1 of the prior year. So for almost every jurisdiction we're working in Westchester County, the valuation date isn't current, it's last July 1st. And obviously the virus is not a factor in that regard. So next year, depending upon what happens with the market, only time will tell, then the COVID situation will play a part in it. But this year, we're looking back in time. So if we're filing a case in June of 2020, we need to know what the market value is as of July 1, 2019.
Gotcha. And I think a lot of people don't understand that there is that 1-year delay, right? They think that whatever the town, says the value of their property is today is for today, but it's not. That information is really a year old by the time they're really looking at it, correct?
Yes, and there's a practical reason for it. If every property had to be evaluated in current time, there may not be enough comparables to tell the true story. But if you're looking back at July 1 of last year, you can look at sales that occurred on either side of that date to help determine whether there might be a case or not. So the assessment calendar is a little bit tricky, but in general, it's designed in a way that makes it easier to evaluate whether people are eligible for an assessment and tax reduction.
Right. And so, I know with certain towns, you have certain towns that have done, what's called 100% assessment, and then you have others that, you have to use what's called the residential assessment ratio to kind of determine, where the town feels the market value is. Can you kind of explain the reasoning behind that, the numbers on the back end of that?
Sure. So there's certain municipalities, North Salem, Greenberg, Ossining, Pelham, Mamaroneck, Bronxville Village, Rye Town, that have done revaluation. So they maintain their role at 100% of value. Frankly, that's the right thing to do. It makes things much fairer for taxpayers in a system that's based solely on value, whereas other municipalities, the ones I didn't mention, are not at full value. So you look at your assessment and it might be something like $8,500 and you have no idea what that means. So as you said, you need to train by the residential assessment ratio. They're available on our website, retiredassessor.com, to truly know what your assessment means in terms of market value.
Right. And so, so how would I kind of instinctively know, like, should I even try, to get my taxes lowered or my assessment lowered? What should people be looking at for that?
Well, people should know the assessment roll is a bell curve. Many people think that assessors have the ability to raise revenue, and that's not true. The assessment process is a zero-sum process. So all else being equal, if somebody's assessment is raised, that's not bringing in more revenue for the municipality, whether it be the town, the county, the school. It's simply making things fairer. So all else being equal, if one person's assessment's raised, everybody else in town would pay a little bit less. So being that it's a bell curve, there are certainly, and certainly bell curves, a term we've heard a lot about lately for other reasons, but there's clearly going to be people that are underassessed, typically, especially in lower Westchester, older homes, pre-war homes. And then there's people that are overassessed and people that hover around the middle. In our business, we use a 10% differential because when you're within a reasonable range, I, as a former assessor and a believer in the rough equity system, would consider it to be fair and very difficult to overcome or have the burden of proof. So what we do to evaluate is we take a look at the assessment, we have a conversation with the potential client, and generally speaking, maybe 3 or 4 out of 5 phone calls, we can determine pretty quickly whether people are a reduction. And then if we don't know, what we do is we have a mechanism where we can have a third-party professional appraiser review that assessment, that property rather, to see whether or not, in his opinion, it's a candidate for reduction. We don't take cases unless we know they're valid cases. We don't want to burden the municipality. We don't want to disappoint clients. And for that reason, we use a 10% differential.
So, okay, so basically, if the value of a property is coming in within 10% of where the town has it valued at, then your feeling is that your taxes are probably about where they need to be. No need to kind of go in on that.
In my opinion, we're always quick to tell people this is subjective. Our appraisers or a third-party group that we use, they may not be completely correct. It's a subjective business. And accordingly, if we think you don't have a case, we're going to let you know that this is subjective. You might want to check with others because we can't always prove we're right or wrong. And accordingly, people should be aware that they still have the right. And the 10% is not law. That is our particular model. Again, I'm a believer in rough equity. Now, having said that, if somebody has a recent sale and it's 10% or 9%, that would be an exception to the rule, because then you have a number that's very definitive in terms of the fair market value of the property.
I see. So let's say, for example, I did, get my taxes grieved. I got my assessment lowered. I'm happy. It's great. But maybe they're shifting in the market, and you're saying, hey, maybe I should challenge this again. I mean, should people challenge their assessment every year?
No, I don't believe in that at all. Assessors hate that, frankly. And usually, it's not productive. There's people that postcards every year to take a shot. I'm definitely not a believer in that. It's not about taking a shot. It's about fairness based on value. So fair-minded people want to know whether their assessment's fair and whether they're paying their fair share. But to to take a shot at it every year or every other year isn't usually productive, and it really does bog down the system for the local assessors who have to determine who has a case and who doesn't. Furthermore, there's a whole bunch of people who return postcards or contracts from some of the mass mailer groups, and these groups will file underassessed properties. We would see it all the time. The last thing in the world my home were underassessed is somebody to bring it to the assessor's attention. If I were underassessed, I wouldn't even go to town hall for a fishing license.
Right. So yeah, and it's interesting you bring that up, because every year I get in the mail, probably a couple of letters, saying, reduce your taxes, and they want you to fill out some form and send it in. So what is that all about? I mean, what's going on with those?
Well, there are some, I'm not going to condemn an entire industry, but some of those mass mailer groups are good, and they will take the time to determine ahead of time whether a property is a candidate for reduction, and others are going to file simply because you return a postcard. And as I said, that's just not the right way to go about it. When I was an assessor, I saw what these groups did, and frankly, when I retired, I said, I'm going to do it just the opposite. We're going to carefully determine ahead of time whether we believe there's a valid case and not file it unless there is one. I don't believe people should do it often. We tell our clients check back with us every 4 or 5 years. The residential assessment ratio tracks the market, and accordingly, if your assessment is fair in year one, it should be relatively fair in all future years. It's not about, again, taking a shot to see what might happen. I'm not a believer in that, and I think to a great extent it creates a difficult burden for the assessors.
No, absolutely. So talk about your process. Like, so for example, somebody, reaches out to you. What is the process that you go through from start to finish?
If we get a call, just somebody who's calling, they saw our ad or one of these sorts of meetings, we will ask them what they believe the value of their home is. They may have a pretty good feel. Believe it or not, a lot of taxpayers, you might have this experience yourself, Mark, have a rough idea as to the value of the home. And a lot of information on the internet. So some people will tell me when I equalize their assessment and say, you're paying taxes as if your home was worth $600,000, and they say, I could get a lot more than that. I said, well, then this is going to be a short conversation, and thanks for calling, because you're not a candidate for reduction. If we have a conversation and neither they nor I, through a quick look, have an idea as to whether they're overassessed, we ask them to do a property profile on our website, effectively describing their home as accurately as possible. We then acknowledge receipt, send it to a third-party professional appraiser, and within a few days, we're going to have our answer in that appraiser's opinion. So this way, we will have a pretty good feel for the fair market value of the property, and we will call the potential client and tell them, if in fact they have a case for sure, they are underassessed, they shouldn't ever challenge, or they're in the ballpark and we think it's too close to call for our business model. So we try very carefully to figure it out so that they have a pretty good feel for whether they are in that group of overassessed properties.
Gotcha. And now, as far as the business model, like, and as far as compensation, how does that work with you know, property tax consultant?
We charge an industry standard 50% of the first year's savings. For those cases that are not related to a transaction, the client pays for the appraisal, again, assuming we've predetermined it to be a case, but that appraisal fee is refunded in the event that the case is unsuccessful, which in our situation is about 1%. It's important to me as a former assessor that all of our evidence is third party. I don't want to be in a position to earn a contingency fee and be the same person to put a value on a property. That's another thing that I don't agree with in terms of some other business models. There's nothing illegal about it. I just find it to be a conflict. I do think also that it weakens the evidence that's being submitted.
Gotcha. And so let's say you, I mean, you've got a very good case for, you know, the taxes coming down. You've crossed your T's, dotted your I's, and for whatever reason, you know, the assessor or the assessor, you know, assessment board is not agreeing with you. They're not coming down at all, or they're not coming down where it needs to be. What happens then?
Well, we go to the second stage. It's a court proceeding known as Small Claims Assessment Review, referred to as SCAR. And then prior to a trial date, we'll have the opportunity to negotiate the case with the municipality. Most cases are resolved in that format. Relatively few go to trial, more so with groups that have cursory or weak evidence. But trials for us are rare, but they do happen from time to time. It is subjective. I certainly respect the assessor's opinions, even when they disagree. And there are times when a comparable sale will come up after the appraisal is done that tells a little bit of a different story. So we're open-minded. We try very hard to get the best results. On the other hand, we understand the position that the assessors are in. They have to do their job. So we try to find the right answer for each and every case.
Right. And just for everybody that's on the webinar, if you have any questions for Rich, please use the chat button on your screen there for Zoom. Just type in your question, and I'm happy to, you know, answer or get that to Rich so he can answer them. So, you know, Rich, should someone, you know, if they think their taxes are too high and they're thinking about grieving their taxes, is this something? Should they run down and well, they can't really do it right now, but should they go directly to the assessor? Should they, you know, I mean, I'm sure you would say they should have an expert in their field, but, you know, what's the downside from, say, going directly to the assessor and just, you know, filling out some paperwork?
None whatsoever, Mark. I'm in a business like an accountant. Some people prefer to have their tax returns done by a professional, and some people will do them on their own. There's no difference. I, as a former assessor, would never discourage anybody from doing it on their own. And whenever that question comes up, I say, absolutely, you can try it on your own. There's no harm in doing that. Most assessors are fair-minded. That doesn't necessarily mean they're going to agree with your evidence, but if they do that, they should go prepared. You can't say, my neighbors are paying less. You can't use other assessments in order to determine whether yours is fair, because the other properties could be underassessed. So find out what the fair market value is as of the prior July 1, and certainly attempt to challenge on your own if you like. More power to you. I have no issues with that whatsoever, and it's a very valid point.
And it's interesting that you bring up being underassessed, right? So, you know, some people think that they're being, you know, their taxes are way too high. You know, I'll go into their home, meet with them, and it turns out actually their taxes are actually below where they should be. They still think they're too much. And, you know, talk about kind of the, I guess the risks or challenges, you know, when your taxes are below market. if you do some work to that house, what could happen?
Well, another great question. There are certainly plenty of underassessed homes, just as many as there are overassessed homes. And it's careful to understand that. Everybody thinks their taxes are expensive, but there's a difference between expensive and unfair. So accordingly, that's why we're going to let them know whether we believe it's fair or not. Now, if you're in a municipality that has done a revaluation and you are underassessed, sooner or later they may catch up with you and you might see a significant change in your assessment. And because the municipality is treating everybody fairly by tweaking assessments on a regular basis to keep it and maintain it at 100% of value, it's fair. It's the right thing to do. If you're in a municipality that has not done a revaluation and you're underassessed, you're grandfathered and you will not be paying anymore, even though you're underassessed, with one exception. If improvements are made or discovered, then the assessor is going to be taking a look at that value that may have been contributed by those improvements and adding to your assessment to the extent that you've contributed to value. You, I'm sure, have seen when a property is listed and a brand new kitchen is there and maybe there wasn't a permit done. We used to call that midnight carpentry on the other side. But the bottom line is, if the assessor becomes aware of improvements, they absolutely have an obligation to see whether or not an increase is warranted.
And do they have to actually go in the house to do that?
No. As a matter of fact, now, I mean, who knows what's going to happen with COVID and people allowing access, but assessors are never, you never have to let an assessor or their staff into your home. That's the law. They have no legal right to come in. You can let them in, and I recommend you do, because their job is trying to make it fair. And without the interior inspection, who knows the condition of the home and whether or not it makes sense to adjust it one way or the other. So assessors are not, as I said, legally allowed in your home unless you allow them. But I do suggest they do it. Now, if in fact they're not allowed in, or building permits are issued and they don't have time because everything kind of compacts into one time of year in the spring, they're going to do it from their office and try to determine what they believe fair market value is for new construction, renovations, additions, things like that.
Right. And speaking of letting them in or not letting them in, if the appraiser requests to come, assessor requests to come into your home because they suspect that you've done work to it or whatever, and you say no, can that assessor, jack that number up, as high as reasonably allowed? Does that happen?
Assessors are obligated to make it fair. As I said earlier, they're not bringing any more revenue in. They're simply trying to make it fair so that somebody who may have had improvements isn't going to be subsidized by all the other taxpayers. So if there's 3 or 4 contractor vans and a couple of dumpsters outside and no permit's been issued, and the owner says, I'm not letting you in, well, I can assure you there's a healthy increase in that assessment, and then the burden passes to the taxpayer to prove that that new assessment is wrong. So I always encourage taxpayer to cooperate with the assessor. It's all about fairness and value, and sooner or later they're going to catch up with you.
Right, and to prove that the assessor is wrong, they essentially at that point wouldn't need to allow the assessor in to see the work, correct?
I'm sorry, I missed that, Mark.
So in order to prove that new assessment was wrong, if they did do some work but didn't let the assessor in the first round, if they wanted to get that down, they would have to get the assessor in there now to see what's actually happened. Yeah.
Numerous times in my career, people said, nope, you're not coming in, and sometimes not very politely, and later saying, please come by and look at my home. It's not anywhere near what you thought it was. But to be fair to the other taxpayers, assessors might be a little bit more aggressive when they have no opportunity to see what improvements have been made.
Right, I understand. So just once again, if you have any questions, just put them in the chat box. And Rich, so what other points do you think are important for homeowners to know right now as far as their property taxes go?
Well, I think it's important for taxpayers to know that it's all about market value and fairness. Assessors are simply trying to make it fair based on value. For those municipalities that have not done a revaluation, it's merely impossible. Not a day goes by when somebody doesn't bang their fist on the assessor's desk and talks about the underassessed properties, and the assessor's hands are tied. They can't raise that assessment unless they discover improvements or there's a revaluation. So keep in mind that if you are legitimately overassessed, you should challenge, perhaps have somebody represent you. But if you think you're in the ballpark, leave it alone. I do think it's never going to be perfect. Assessment rolls are far from perfect, even those that have done revaluations. And many towns have had the political courage to do the revaluation, have done a very, very good job, but there's still over and under assessed properties. It's a subjective business.
Right. And when you talk about towns doing a full reassessment, just to kind of share with our listeners, what does that exactly mean?
Well, these assessment rolls in Westchester County are generally decades old. When I was the assessor for the town of Eastchester, the last time they did a revaluation was 1941. In Mount Vernon, Abraham Lincoln was alive when they last did a
So recent. It was a recent reassessment.
I'm sorry?
It was a recent reassessment.
Well, 7 or 8 municipalities chose to do the right thing, put everybody at full market value. It does come with political, social ramifications. Senior citizens who have been underassessed had no idea. Suddenly they may be paying twice as much in property taxes as before, and they might not be able to afford that. So there's a lot of issues involved with revaluation, but the law says all property must be assessed at a uniform percentage of value, and accordingly, my job shouldn't exist. It should be very fair and very reasonable, but it's very expensive to do a revaluation. There's going to be a lot of heartache. There's going to be a lot of difficult situations for people, and that's a legitimate reason why some politicians will say, you know what, it's not for us, at least not at this time. But right. I think it should be fair. Put me out of business if they wish. But I think that it's up to the municipality to make it fair. Why should somebody have to pay me for something they're entitled to in the first place, a fair tax bill?
Right, and just in your history, I mean, what is some of the largest assessments that you have grieved? I mean, as far as percentages being over.
We have saved some of our clients $60,000, $70,000 a year in taxes. And some are, $1,000 a year in taxes. And sometimes you'd be surprised who is more grateful. Outcome. So again, we have had the range. We don't file unless we think it's legitimately overassessed. I've probably said that 3 or 4 times now. But the point I'm making is that we don't take cases unless there's legitimate savings. And it's not about our fee. It's about the fairness aspect of it. So we try very hard. We have about a 99% success rate. Sometimes things will pop up, as I said, comparables that occur after the appraisal is done. And you say, wow, how am I going to argue the house next door sold for effectively what the assessment is? And for some reason, a sale kills the case. But that's fairly rare.
Gotcha. Well, Rich, thank you so much for joining us today. I really do appreciate it. If for some reason you had a question as regards to taxes or lowering your property taxes and want some more specific advice geared to your specific home, please reach out to Rich O'Donnell. His number is 914-779-4444. Obviously, if you have any real estate specific questions, I'm happy to answer those. Whether it's for buying real estate or selling real estate, we're happy to help you with that. No obligation either way. So again, Rich, thank you so much for joining us today. I really do appreciate you taking out the time. Look forward to seeing you hopefully soon when this all ends, and hope everybody has a great week.
Mark, you and your staff are wonderful. I really enjoy working with them. You guys are great. So I appreciate today's invitation.
Thanks, Rich. Take care.
Okay,
Take
bye-bye.
care, everybody.